as we go forward? Like, do you see this like 10 years from now that it replaces radiologists? You know, you just do the scan and then at the end of it, you get a green light or a red light, and like that's it. Like the computer does the whole thing. Like, how do you see this, as we go on?
Yeah, it's a great question and obviously highly debated. There's no doubt that there's going to be some amount of job functions that are accelerated and improved by AI. Now, to the question of is AI just going to replace all of our doctors in the next 5-10 years? That's not going to happen. And what we will see is AI and doctors working together to produce the best possible outcome for the patient. There's still a lot of advantages that humans have from just a creativity and problem solving point of
Yeah.
view that AI does not even come close to touching yet. And
But
so
it potentially filters out certain work that the radiologist won't have to do, right? Like they get to run it through a product like yours, and your product maybe give it a probability score of like what are the odds that this person has
Mhm.
breast cancer, and if it comes back like less than 1%, you're like, okay, whatever, we're not even going to look at it, right? Like it essentially does change some parts of it, I would imagine. And we're back for another episode of the Startup Hustle. This is your host today, Matt Watson. Very excited to be joined today by Tim Cogan, who's the CTO and co-founder of MedCognetics. He has an AI company in healthcare, although it's not generative AI, it's more traditional AI, doing some pretty cool stuff. We're going to talk about how AI is impacting the healthcare market today, talk about his background as a first-time CTO and the struggles of starting as a tech company. Before we get started, I do want to remind everybody, if you need help building tech, that's what we do. I have 62 companies I work for, 300 employees, startups, scale-ups, building all sorts of technology. If you need .NET developers, PHP, Python, Ruby, whatever it is, you can check us out at fullscale.io. Tim, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Matt. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So tell us real quick about what you guys do exactly. I probably butchered it, but it's my understanding it's AI and radiology. Tell us a little bit more about what it is exactly you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with a little bit of context. So about 1 in 8 women in the United States will be diagnosed with breast cancer at some point in life. So that means we all know a mom, a sister, daughter, a close family friend who will probably be diagnosed and battle breast cancer at some point. So it's really, breast cancer is an issue that affects all of us in a big way. And so the natural question is, what can we do about this? How can we improve patient outcomes? And that's really at the core of what MedCognetics is working on right now. Specifically, how can we use AI to improve patient outcomes? And there's a lot of answers to this question, a lot of things you can do. But in particular, what we're looking at is identifying cancer as early as possible through the screening process. The earlier you can identify cancer, the less it's spread, the less it's grown, the easier it is to remove from the body. And so we do this by improving the screening process in particular. The way that screening for breast cancer typically works, and this can vary by region of the world or country, but in the United States, women over the age of 40 are typically recommended to go in for screening every other year or every year, and then at a particular age, it's switched to every other year. And we take X-rays of the breast tissue or a kind of CT known as digital breast tomography. And in those images, we look for changes in the tissue year after year, changes that are indicative of breast cancer. Okay. So this has been shown to work very well in countries with strong screening processes. It's been shown that this really does improve patient outcomes, but there's still room for improvement. The screening process can be better. It is unfortunately the case that cancer is not always caught. Sometimes it's missed.
And the key here is you're doing it. It's year over year testing. Like it's comparing one result to the next and looking for the differences. That's the key here.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be looking for the differences. Some patients come in, and this is particularly true in certain parts of the world. A patient might come in who's never been in before, right? But they're, for one reason or another, maybe because of more awareness on their part, or sometimes they're feeling some sort of symptoms, they may go in for the first time. So there's also a use case where you just have one time
Okay.
image.
Is it, I hate to make it sound like is it easy or hard to identify cancer, but is it really hard to identify it from one image, or is it much easier if you're comparing and seeing the differences?
Comparison is definitely helpful. And the comparison's not only from year to year, but it's very helpful to compare kind of left side of the body from the right side.
Okay. So,
So,
so how
yeah.
did you guys get into this? How did you guys come up with this idea? Is like is your business partner, in this, like a radiologist, or how did you guys get into this?
Yeah, great question. In 2017, I started a part-time PhD at the University of Texas at Dallas. I was working full-time in industry as a software engineer. And I started my PhD in this research group called the Quality of Life Labs. And the research project I started working on was this issue of breast cancer screening. And
Okay.
in that academic research, we developed some very promising results and an effective system in 2020. And there were some things leading up to that, but in 2020, we started MedCognetics, really built upon that research that was being done.
Okay.
It looked like what we were doing could have a significant impact for patients around the world. And there's some particular things that we were doing and are still doing that we believe are a differentiator in this space.
So then, does this end up being a partnership with the school, like where the school owns part of the company, or you license the technology from them, or?
Yeah, there's still an ongoing relationship between the university and the company.
Okay.
And
Well, very,
yeah,
very cool. So I'm.
no,
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say, so I think there's a lot of great partnerships like that, right? Where
Mhm.
research can lead to something that can be productized and brought to market. There was a local company here that did something kind of similar, where it had to do with intellectual property and sort of algorithm sort of thing around detecting veins in the eyes. And a local entrepreneur here took that, and that became a company called iVerify, which is now built into all of your cell phones. They figured out how to productize that and sold that to a bunch of the major phone companies to do like how your phone unlocks,
Great
looking
call.
at your eyes
Yeah.
and stuff and detecting the. So and again, it came out of the idea and all this stuff originally came out of the college. So it's really cool to see these sort of research things come through and go to the commercial market. So it's really cool that you're able to take advantage of this. So you have other founders that are part of your team. Were they also schoolmates of yours at the college, or?
Yeah, so there's definitely an ongoing relationship there. We do have individuals at UT Dallas who are still, close advisors to the company. Two of the employees that we've hired on are UT Dallas graduates. We've had some interns from UTD, and in general, the school has just been very supportive. So yeah, just to reiterate the point that you made, the academic and corporate relationship can work out very well, and in our case, it has worked out very well.
So what was it like building the software for this? Because this isn't like normal software. You're like, okay, I type in some data in a screen, it saves in a database. It's not that kind of software at all. So what's it like to build software that's analyzing these giant images, trying to identify if somebody has breast cancer potentially?
Yeah, there's a lot of aspects that make it challenging. One is it is, at least in the early days, it was very much a research project, right? And you don't even know if it's going to work. It's not like you're building a website or you're following something that someone else has done. We were trying something new and doing a lot of experiments, some of which weren't necessarily successful, until we got to where we are. Another thing that makes, I think, this kind of software difficult is in a lot of areas, software developers can operate in sort of a closed loop environment. And what I mean by that is the software developers ourselves really understand the output and what we're supposed to be building. Prior to MedCognetics, I was at a company called AMS, developing software for consumer electronics, particularly
Okay.
cell phones. So as a software developer, we all have cell phones. We all understand the application, and we sort of know what good phone behavior is versus bad phone behavior. The challenge when you start developing software in the medical environment is you really need a physician expert opinion to help you in the development cycle. So even something as simple as let's say we're debugging the algorithm and there's an image and the algorithm says, hey, this image has cancer. But the label we have for that image says there's no cancer. Me being a software engineer, I can't look at the image and
Yeah.
it
You
just,
don't know.
yeah, I'm not an expert. And so I have to take that to one of the radiologists we work with and discuss this data with them and get their expert opinion. So you really need a physician in the loop for the whole development process, and that makes it a lot more challenging. But like many things, that if you overcome those challenges, there's a lot of reward.
So the way that this was built was by collecting like thousands of these types of images and tagging them if somebody has cancer or doesn't have cancer, and then training an algorithm based off that. That's the way you built this?
Yeah, that's at a high level. That's right. It's
Okay.
pulling in a lot of examples, and there's different degrees at which you can train with images. Some images have more annotation than others, so sometimes you might just have this had cancer or it didn't have cancer, and that's kind of a yes or no. In some cases, more or less roughly where the cancer is located. And in some cases, there's some data we have that there's no label at all, right? So
Yeah.
if you want to leverage that, you have to be operating in a completely unsupervised type of approach.
So there was nobody else doing this when you guys started doing this?
So there are some other companies that were doing this and are currently doing this. So one of the differentiators and one of the things that we've really worked to overcome is this issue of making sure the AI generalizes well, not just across demographics, say within the United States, but really across patients all around the world. So, some of the early papers and still some of the research you see in the AI space, people will pull data from, let's say, a particular area. Let's say they have a partnership with a hospital in New York or some other place. All of their train and test data might be more or less geographically centralized.
Okay.
Or even if they have multiple sources, it might just be 3 or 4. And we really wanted to have data representative of patients from every continent, from every kind of demographic, to have a system that's truly generalizes and is truly as unbiased as possible. And so, some of the challenges we had to overcome in that is there's parts of the world that it's hard to get data, right? There's no high-speed internet connection that you can
Yeah. And
take
these
the images and
images really are different from people who have different ethnic background. There really is a lot of difference.
yeah, diet, lifestyle, all sorts of factors
Okay.
can result in differences. So, some of the challenges we had to overcome is just even educating certain locations on how to export the data properly. How do you get it onto an encrypted
Yeah.
hard drive? How do we ship that to somewhere securely that we can upload it into the cloud? All of these logistics. And then even once you
So
have the data, you might need to clean, curate,
so
and
what's interesting is there's a company here in Kansas City called Data Appraisal that actually sells this kind of data. So they collect all this sort of medical research data and then sell it to people like you that for these purposes. Like that's
like,
actually become a real big thing over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Is with AI and all these different things, like even with generative AI, right? People are trying to collect all this data to examine different medical records and all this different kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a local Kansas City company that's what they do. They're just trying to solve this problem.
yeah, and that's right. There's definitely, when we started, especially when I started back in 2017, there was less awareness and less focus. And to your point, there are more and more companies popping up. And we have and do work with other companies to collect data. So it's a mix, right? There's some
Yeah.
data we've collected and annotated and curated ourselves. There are situations where we might need we're missing a particular demographic or a machine type or something we want to add to our pool of data. In that case, yeah, we'd go to a company like you're describing and develop some sort of relationship or long-term partnership.
So how do you see AI affecting healthcare as we go forward? Like, do you see this like 5 or 10 years from now that it replaces radiologists? You just do the scan and then at the end of it, you get a green light or a red light, and like that's it. Like the computer does the whole thing. Like, how do you see this, as we go on?
Yeah, there, it's a great question and obviously highly debated. There's no doubt that there's going to be some amount of job functions that are accelerated and improved by AI. Now, to the question of is AI just going to replace all of our doctors in the next 5, 10 years? That's not going to happen. And what we will see is AI and doctors working together to produce the best possible outcome for the patient. There's still a lot of advantages that humans have from just a creativity and problem solving point of
Yeah,
view that AI does not even come close to touching yet. And
but
so
it but it potentially filters out certain work that the radiologist won't have to do, right? Like they get to run it through a product like yours, and your product maybe give it a probability score of like what are the odds that this person has
Mhm.
breast cancer, and if it comes back like less than 1%, you're like, okay, whatever, we're not even going to look at it, right? Like it essentially does change some parts of it, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's true. I think one area it will definitely help is, right now radiologists are sort of looking for the needle in the haystack, right? They're looking for that one patient who has cancer or really needs help out of a bunch of patients who don't. Currently, kind of the same amount of time is allocated for everyone, right? One thing I think AI will help with is prioritize where, if I go in for my yearly physical checkup or whatever, and I'm healthy and there's no problems, you know, my doctor doesn't need to spend the full like 20 minutes just talking to me about nothing, right? Like that. I
Definitely not on your mammogram.
Right, but there's value. But what would be better is that the time for the patient with cancer, or whatever, can be really focused in on the patients who need
Yeah.
it the most. So I think from a workflow perspective, how do we allocate radiologists' time or doctors' time more generally? It's going to be helpful. And there have been studies already showing that these AI tools accelerate the rate at which doctors work, and that gives them more time to spend with patients or gives them more time to spend in research or doing other things that um, ultimately improve the healthcare system.
Well, and that's the same thing I see in software development. Like, I don't really see AI replacing software developers. It makes us more productive, or we can spend more time on other things. Because, like, actually, for software development, the easiest part is writing the code. It's like getting everybody to agree on what code we're going to write is the hard part. When you understand that, you're the CTO of this company.
Yeah.
I think you probably understand. Like, you can spend forever trying to agree, like, how are we going to do this thing? How are we not going to do this thing? And all the different details that go into it. And then when you actually go do it, it might be like 10 lines of code.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and there's a good friend of mine, and he says that his most productive day is when he's actually removing lines of code. He's making the code
Yeah.
shorter. So it's yeah.
Well, I
No,
do.
that's definitely true. I agree.
I do want to take a minute to remind everybody today's episode is brought to you by Fullscale. If you're looking to hire software developers and grow your team, check us out at fullscale.io. Also, sign up for my newsletter at startuphustle.xyz. About 20,000 people subscribe to the Startup Hustle newsletter. Great content a couple times a week. So, Tim, I'm curious to ask you, this company is the first time that you've been a CTO. You got a long background in doing software development, a bunch of different things. I did a poll one day as part on LinkedIn about how do people become a CTO, and it was like 40 something percent of the people became a CTO because they were a startup founder. They didn't get promoted to CTO. They're CTO because they started the company. And that's you. You're that guy. You became CTO from starting a company. And one of the things I'm curious to ask you is just how is being a CTO and being a business owner, that's the key, how has it changed your perspective on software development?
Yeah, that's a good question, and yeah, maybe to get to your point about this seems to be the route a lot of people move into this kind of position. I don't know that at least several years ago, I didn't see myself in this kind of role. In fact, one of the reasons I started a PhD is I wanted to be very technical. Kind of that how I envisioned my career was being really a deep technical subject matter expert. And obviously, if you're once you start a company, you move into more of a role of a CTO. There's a lot of responsibilities that come with that. Although you have to remain very knowledgeable and deep in the technology, you have to really learn to generalize and broaden your skill set and focus on a lot of different things involved with the company. Um,
It's
yeah, no, go ahead.
So it becomes a lot more business related stuff, a lot
Mhm.
more strategy, leadership.
Exactly.
But then as a business owner, like it's just whatever it takes to make the business work, right? And if it's being on a podcast today, if it's helping doing sales, I imagine you probably do a lot of stuff that's kind of more like sales engineer work, right? Like you're talking to potential clients and talking to them about the technology, how the technology works, how it would solve their problems, and you're
Exactly.
able to
Yeah.
and speak that language, right? Where maybe a salesperson or one of your other founders or whatever, doesn't speak the technology quite the same way. So you bridge that gap.
Yeah, yeah, that's also true. And yeah, it's also the case, like you said, there was definitely a transition in my career where there was a point in time where I cared a lot about what I worked on. I'd say when I was younger in my career, I really cared about what I did on a day-to-day basis. And now I care more about just what's the outcome. What's the outcome of my work? And that's what really drives me. So yeah, if I get to write code one day, well, that's great. But if it's being on a podcast, if it's doing some amount of travel, if it's working on the website, if it's writing documentation, whatever it is, if it furthers the goal of what we're trying to do as a business, if it in any way can improve patient outcomes like we're trying to do, sign me up. I'll do it.
But
I'll take
that's
it on.
that's a big mindset shift. And it sounds like you're going to agree with me, or you're just like, oh, before I want to be a PhD, I want to be very technical, I want to be an expert, all this stuff. Where a lot of developers, they love code, they love writing code, they want to build the world's perfect code or whatever. And now, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're like, you know what? That's great, but I care about the outcome of the work and less about the work itself, which is a
Yeah,
total mind shift change, right?
yeah. That's right. That's right. And I think, I would encourage all developers to embrace that mindset a little bit. I mean, I think everyone's built differently. Everyone kind of comes to work with a different mindset and perspective, and that's a good thing. But developers, and I used to fall into this as well. You can have kind of a very narrow mindset where I used to come into work and think like, I am a, C or Python expert or whatever. This is what I do. That's kind of my purpose in the company. And I would challenge anyone to think more broadly. I think as an engineer or any type of developer, what you do on a day-to-day basis is really you solve problems. You're a problem solver. And so it doesn't really matter what the software stack it is. It doesn't matter how much of your code is written by ChatGPT or whatever. Like doesn't matter how the industry shifts. You know, the way that you contribute to the world or society is you come into work and you find a problem and you solve it.
But did you think that way through like 5 years ago? Like, would you have said that same thing 5 years ago?
No, no, I think probably not. I was more kind of more
Yeah.
narrow focused on and kind of what it was I did and where I found my value.
So I've been a CTO or CEO of my own tech companies now for 20 years. And I think 20 years later, like I don't even care about the code at all.
Hmm.
I feel like I can hire anybody to write the code. Like, not that that part's not important, but it's like it's not a challenge. Like I know I can hire somebody to write the code and build whatever needs to be built. The challenge is always the rest of the business that to me is the hard part. Like how do we get this to market? The outcome of the work, do people see value in it? Will people pay for it? How do we scale and grow the business? Like those are really really hard problems. To me, writing the code is the easy part. Now, maybe for what you're doing, what you're doing
Yeah,
is really
yeah.
hard with AI. There's own
The
set of challenges with that, but
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on what you're doing. I would say like some of the guys who work at our company who are more on a day-to-day basis deep in the code, they are solving very hard problems. And I
Yeah.
appreciate like sometimes we'll talk about something and then they'll go off and they'll find a solution. And I think, well, that's brilliant. Like they did a great job going out and finding a solution to a problem we had. They're solving a different sphere of problems as I'm
Yeah.
solving, but it's not any more or less about like it's just as necessary for the company.
Yeah. What are some other things you say that you've really learned from being a CTO that has been different than previous in your career?
I really just all of the lessons learned with doing this kind of stuff. It's easy to have an illusion of how much you know. There's a classic example of like a pencil. If you ask people, do you know how a pencil is made? Most people say, "Oh, of course I know how a pencil is made." But then you ask them about the details of that, and soon everyone realizes that, like, no, actually, I don't know where pencils come from or how they're created. And I'd say when you step into a role of starting a company, you realize all these smaller parts of the company that you sort of took for granted. You're like, oh, website's easy, right? Everyone does a website, you know, but actually there are details there. Um, you know, Different parts of the regulatory system, even just, managing employees and other aspects. Um, there's just a lot of detail there to really try to embrace, and you realize just how little you know.
You form a new appreciation for all those things that you didn't have to deal with before.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if I were to someday work at a large company again, I'd suddenly appreciate everyone outside of, the software development group and everything that they do, and what a big task it is to accomplish that. I mean, you really need the whole organization to drive the ship forward.
So I'm curious, what is it like building software in healthcare, specifically with AI and like cancer diagnosis? So I guess it's more of a screening tool, anyways. Probably it's not like the final diagnosis, probably. But in regards to like FDA clearance and all that kind of stuff, what is that part of this like?
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's going to vary. FDA clearance versus getting cleared in other countries is not necessarily the same. And some of that is like when you clear a product for FDA, the FDA wants to see efficacy for US patients. And there's additional testing requirements that you wouldn't even find in like an academic setting. So they're very rigorous on, we don't want any sort of test train leakage, for example. If whatever your test data is, it needs to come from like a hospital or a clinic or someplace that none of your training data has come from. So you either need to go to another state or another like hospital or clinic. Um, so it's pretty rigorous, and the FDA has a pretty high standard on making sure, obviously, that these things are
Hmm.
effective and that there's no chance that you're gonna cause any sort of problems to a screening system that already works, fairly well.
Well, so even for something that is just a screening system, you have to get FDA approval.
Yeah, yeah,
That seems kind of crazy to me that they have that much red tape for something that is a screening tool. But I mean, I guess if it's wrong, then it's like you miss things in the screening tool. So even though it's not the diagnosis, you would miss people that should have got, further, analysis. So I guess it
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah. And I'd say, that's right. There's risk. Even the screening process, there's risk of causing more harm than good, right? You think about if you have a patient who's screened who doesn't have cancer, they're totally
Hmm.
cancer free. Theoretically, they didn't even need a screening, but they go through the screening process, and if you incorrectly tell them they have cancer
Right.
and that they need follow up, you think about the amount of time, the amount of
Right.
stress.
Expense of testing, further
Yeah, I
testing.
mean, like you've actually made that person's life worse for no reason, and that's a big deal. And so I do get, even for something like a screening tool, if you or I went
If
in,
you get it wrong.
yeah, and if some AI algorithm said, oh yeah, Tim has cancer or Matt has cancer when we go in, it causes a lot of stress. It's a big deal. So I get it. I get it. And I think, generally I think in this space, in the medical device space, I mean, I don't really have experience elsewhere, but I think the FDA does a pretty good job.
Okay. So how long does it take to go through that FDA approval process?
The approval process is, the approval itself can be on the order of months. I mean, you can find out, when the FDA says they're going to have a response back to you and all that. I'd say the biggest work is kind of all the upfront of getting your documentation together, following your design process, having appropriate test data, getting the whole package together that you're going
Okay.
to submit to the FDA. That's really the hardest part. Um,
So
but
so let's say you go through this whole thing, you
Mhm.
spend a year, you get all together, you get approved. Then what happens if you need to change your software or change the algorithm? Do you have to go back through all of it again before you can release updates to it?
um, Good question. It depends on the scope of the change. If it's, as one example, like if there's a security patch or something, so we monitor regularly. Are there any like vulnerabilities that have popped up in one of the operating system packages
Right.
or something
Sure.
that we use? Obviously, you're gonna update and fix that as quickly as possible. Um, and there's a change process for handling that sort of thing. If you want to add like a new feature, or if you wanted to like retrain your neural network or something that's a bigger, more significant change, then yeah, that would possibly be some sort of resubmission process, or potentially a new product if you're like adding on new features, new outputs,
Okay.
thing like that. It all depends, and there's still, there's a lot of smart people in the FDA who understand the space of AI, and they're constantly thinking about how to maybe change things or accommodate this space, because it's new for everyone.
Developers are always want to do continuous integration, continuous delivery, pushing code to production every day, and all this kind of stuff. Like that does not really apply to this. You're like, we're not going back to the FDA every day. It's like a whole different world.
Yeah, you're not gonna. Yeah, there. I think Mark Zuckerberg was famous for saying, move fast and break things, and
Yeah.
that's good for social media, not so good for medicine, obviously.
Well, I mean, the good news is probably a lot of your platform you can be that way, right? Like, how do we get the images? How do we do this? How do we catalog them? Like a lot of different stuff like that. You can move very quickly, but the actual analysis and the screening part of it is probably has to be under lock and key. Like, that specific feature of the product, right? Like the rest of it, you can kind of move a lot quicker. I would
That's
assume.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, so bringing in new data or something like that. Obviously, we still have processes and procedures for that, but like we don't have to file anything
Yeah.
to the government when we bring in a new data set or something. It has to be documented, but um, yeah, yeah.
Well,
So
so what is the future for this? Where do you see this going? I mean, you guys are doing kind of pilots and different places all over the world, people testing the software. What do you see as the future here?
that's a great question. I think there's a lot of possibilities. I think ultimately in the coming years, we're going to see these technologies just get better and better. I mean, we are still in very much the early stages of AI and what these technologies can do. One thing that's I find interesting about the space of what we're doing is maybe some of the opportunities that patients now have in getting follow-up opinions about their data. As an example, traditionally, let's say you get a set of screening images taken. You may have one radiologist look at those images. Some countries have a second reader, but generally it's expensive and time consuming to try to take your images and have them screened by another person. And in reality, that's not really ideal. I mean, as a patient, you should want, like a committee of radiologists to look at your images.
Yeah.
That would be the best. There's this whole all this math behind jury theorem, right? How do we decide on juries of 6 or 12 people? It's because the more people you kind of assign to a committee and have decide on something, the more accurate of an outcome you're going to have. So one thing I think that's interesting about AI in our space is that as a patient, you could potentially take your images and bring them to a committee of AI algorithms. You
Right.
could get a third, a fourth, fifth, sixth opinion. And that's not always true. You can think of domains like autonomous driving, where time is of the essence, or even
Right.
emergency medicine, brain bleeds, and things like that, where you have to make a decision. The faster you make a decision, the better, right? Inaction
Yep.
can be as deadly as action. But in the case of cancer screening, you have a couple days, even a week is not going to make a difference because there's already, you have to schedule surgery or whatever follow-up treatments anyways.
Yep.
Um,
Makes
so
total
I think,
sense.
yeah, so I don't know. I think that's exciting for patients, and I think it kind of goes to show how much room for growth there is.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be great if every patient could have a radiologist plus 6 AI, a committee of 7 people or whatever, look at their images and give just a really highly accurate outcome that, people can be happy about.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. Again, this was Tim Cogan, CTO and co-founder of MedCognetics. It's really interesting learning about AI. People are talking about generative AI all the time, but there's still a lot of work going on out there doing work like you guys using, more traditional AI and machine learning. So very cool to see how this kind of progresses into helping things like X-ray and radiology, MRI, CT scans, all these things. And there's a lot of different companies like yours doing different types of this kind of stuff out there. It's very, very cool technology and a time saver it could be for radiologists and other professionals. So thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
And once again, you can check us out at fullscale.io. It's my company. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter, leave us a review on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you, guys.